So before we move on, let's look at some important vocabulary in the muscle fiber, okay? Like I said, the sarco means flesh. So we're talking about the flesh of the muscle. The plasma membrane of the muscle is called the sarcolemma. So this becomes the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber. And the next terminology over here is sarcoplasm. Sarcoplasm is basically the fancy name for the cytoplasm of the muscle fiber. The sarcoplasm contains specialized endoplasmic reticulum, which we call sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is just a fancy name for the endoplasmic reticulum, and this contains a liquid that is rich in calcium ions. So it stores calcium ions because calcium ions along with ATP are the main factors that drive muscle contraction. Okay. So along with sarcoplasmic reticulum, the sarcoplasm also contains a highly organized structures of contractile myofilaments. Okay, these myofilaments is just a collective term for the thick and thin filament, that is mainly actin and myosin. Along with actin and myosin, there are other support proteins that assist contraction of muscle fiber, but till now the role of actin and myosin is really well understood in muscle contraction. Okay, then the muscle fiber is a multinucleated structure. So it's multinucleated and it contains the nucleus along the periphery. Peripheral nucleus. Okay, peripheral nucleus. So myoblasts are basically stem cells. You can call them progenitor stem cells that are capable of giving rise to muscle cells, and satellite cells on the other hand are multipotent stem cells that can differentiate into muscle cells or more satellite cells upon an injury. So obviously the other structure that needs to be present in the muscle fiber is something to provide energy. The mitochondria is the structure in a cell that produces ATP, and obviously a muscle fiber needs a lot of it because we constantly use our muscles to perform so many different functions. So let's take a quick look at what we've already looked at before in chapter 10. So we'll do a really quick review on the overall anatomy of the muscle. So if you're looking at the muscle attached to a bone, the attachment itself is called tendon. So tendon anchors the bones to the muscle, and it's a tough band of fibrous connective tissue that is made of collagen, and it is continuous with the epimysium. So this epimysium is basically the outermost layer of the muscle. Underneath the epimysium, the layer is known as perimysium. So this is the perimysium, okay? And perimysium basically covers each muscle fascicle, okay? So this is a muscle fascicle. That's a muscle fascicle. This one over here is pulled out for you. So each muscle fascicle is basically a bundle of number of individual muscle fibers. So you see so many individual muscle fibers over here. That's a muscle fiber, another one over here, here. So they contain a bundle of muscle fibers held together in the muscle fascicle. And the fascicle itself is surrounded by an outermost layer you call the perimysium. So this also is the perimysium. Okay, so inside the muscle fascicle, each muscle fiber is again surrounded by more connective tissue known as the endomysium. So if you carefully look over here, so this white space in here is the endomysium. So all the space around each muscle fiber is the endomysium. So right over here, you see a portion of a muscle fiber. The muscle fiber is covered by endomysium, and each muscle fiber is basically a whole bunch of myofibrils held together. So myofibril is basically the smallest contractile unit of the muscle, and this is where the actual contraction occurs. Myofibril contains a bunch of myosin and actin filaments, along with other regulatory proteins where contraction actually occurs. So if you take a cross section of a myofibril, this is what it would look like. It contains a whole bunch of light and dark lines, as you see under the microscope, and they contain several smaller units known as the sarcomere. Okay, so sarcomere. Sarcomere is basically the space between these lines known as Z lines. Okay, so just be familiar with these terms. Don't have to remember all of this just yet, but in between the sarcomere, you have actin and myosin filaments scattered, and when a muscle contracts, the actin filaments are basically pulled, and this region basically shortens to allow contraction. So don't worry about remembering all this yet, but just keep in mind the muscle fiber is a bunch of myofibrils held together, and the myofibril contains myosin and actin filaments arranged in a smaller unit known as sarcomere. And each muscle fiber contains hundreds of sarcomere units. So what you're looking at right now is a muscle fiber. A muscle fiber is a muscle cell, okay? And each muscle fiber is made up of a whole bunch of myofibrils. So you see a whole bunch of myofibrils in here. So you see so many different muscle fibers. This is obviously an artist rendition. And each muscle fiber contains a lot of myofibrils, which are made of myofilaments. And this is where contraction actually occurs. So let's look at the structures again, just so you understand the function of the structures before you move on to muscle physiology. Now, the outermost layer is the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma is basically the plasma membrane of the muscle fiber. And then the sarcoplasm is basically the cytoplasm of the muscle. Okay, now the extensions of the sarcolemma are known as transverse tubules. So the transverse tubules are basically infoldings of the sarcolemma that conduct impulses or action potential from the cell surface. So their main job is to allow conduction of action potential. Action potential is basically the electrical impulse, and the transverse tubules allow the electrical impulses to move deeper and deeper very quickly to allow contraction of muscle fibers. So you can see that the blue structures over here are endoplasmic reticulum, and each myofibril is surrounded by a whole bunch of endoplasmic reticulum and transverse tubules. Now, the ends of the endoplasmic reticulum are known as terminal cisternae. Terminal cisternae are basically enlarged ends. Let me write this down. These are enlarged ends of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And the terminal cisternae and the transverse tubules, which are also known as T tubules, together are called the triad. So this structure that you're seeing over here, two ends on each side of the transverse tubule are this terminal cisternae, and sandwiched in between the two is the transverse tubule. Okay, and this together is called the triad. Now, what is the function of sarcoplasmic reticulum? If you remember, they store calcium ions. I lost my pen. There it is. So they store calcium ions, and calcium ions are very important for muscle contraction. Hammer this into your head. Calcium ions important for muscle contraction. Okay, and then some other structure that you see over here are the nucleus. So they have a whole bunch of nuclei peripherally located along the edges. And then you see a whole bunch of mitochondria embedded to provide ATP for energy. And in between, everywhere, you see a whole bunch of sarcoplasmic reticulum. So you'll obviously see a lot of terminal cisternae and transverse tubules embedded around these myofibrils, because it is important for the action potential to enter the muscle fiber and reach the myofibrils really quickly, so all the muscles can contract together. Okay. So some other structures that you see over here are the A bands and I band. So A band is basically the dark striation that you see under the microscope. Okay, so you see a bunch of dark and light striations. If you look at a muscle fiber, you see dark bands, and in between you see some lighter bands, right? Some light bands. So these dark bands are basically A bands, and the I bands are the light striations that you see under the microscopes. Okay, so just keep this in mind for now. Moving forward, if you remember this, you'll find it really easy to understand the rest of it. Okay, so before you move forward, I suggest you get thorough with the structure of the muscle fiber and these terminologies. And keep in mind, transverse tubules are extensions. So here are transverse tubules, also known as T tubules. The transverse tubules are extensions of the sarcolemma that are associated with the terminal cisternae. The main job of the T tubules is to bring action potentials to the interior of the muscle fiber. Okay, and none of this will happen if there is not enough calcium ion, and none of this will happen if there's not enough ATP in the cell.